Hi everybody, thanks for stopping by to check out the latest from Sailing Emerald Steel. In our last video we talked about the standard way of sizing and pitching your propeller, and in this episode, part 2, we're going to discuss how we went about sizing and pitching our propeller to increase the longevity of our engine and also to get better fuel mileage. And before we get started, we'd like to thank you all for all of your comments. We really appreciate hearing from all of you guys.
So in our last video we showed you what is a standard way of sizing your propeller.
Here is a short recap from part 1, which shows the type of boat, engine, and transmission that our calculations are based on. If you haven't checked out part 1, you should do that too.
The problem with that system is this here, that because when you buy, say, a 40 horsepower engine, you want to get your 40 horsepower, which people who size your propeller realize that. To develop a maximum horsepower, you have to run your engine at the maximum RPM. Now when you run your engine at maximum RPM, the problem is that a larger propeller would not develop the maximum RPM because it would be too much for it, so you would lose your horsepower. And if you have a smaller propeller, which is sized for your RPM on your engine, the problem becomes that your propeller becomes like an egg beater at the high RPM. That means you would have a lot of cavitation at the time when you have any kind of seas or wind against you. That means in a calm condition, a small propeller would get your hull speed and she would push you fine. But as soon as you have any kind of seas or wind, especially for a cruising boat, which is a medium to heavy displacement, you need a good size of propeller to push you forward. Now with a small propeller, it would not push you forward, but you would have a cavitation. Now, to prevent that from happening, what we decided was this here. Every engine has two ratings. One is a horsepower and one is a torque. Now, usually higher torque is rated close to a halfway point of RPM. That means, say, if you have a 4,000 RPM engine, your highest torque is about 22 to 2400. So even if you have a variable pitch propeller, you're still facing the same problem, because to get your maximum RPM to develop for a maximum horsepower, you still have to have a small propeller.
And we've noticed that many cruisers always go full throttle, to get their hull speed, which actually decreases the engine longevity and also is bad for your fuel mileage.
Because if you look at diagram of your engine and the fuel consumption, you will find out that the highest RPM, when you develop your highest horsepower, your fuel consumption is over about 3 times as much as in a low RPM. So you are faced with what to do about it. You pretty much can forget about your maximum horsepower of your engine, but you check the rating of your engine about horsepower versus torque. So we found out that our engine, which is a maximum RPM, was 4,000 and the torque was at 2,400. So I sized my propeller at 2,400 RPM. So now what we accomplish is this here, that we can run a bigger propeller with a higher pitch. That way we can accomplish our hull speed at 2,400 RPM, and also we get a much more pushing power because our propeller is bigger. Now, how you figure out the size of your propeller at that RPM is you go this way. You take your standard size of propeller, which on our first video showed was a 14-inch propeller with a 6-inch pitch. Now, naturally, if you reduce your RPM from 4,000 to 2,400, your shaft RPM is going to be half as much. That means you go from 2,000 RPM down to 1,200 RPM. So what you have to do right now, you have to size your pitch so that at the 1,200 RPM you get the same hull speed as when you had a 2,000 RPM.
By reducing your engine RPM from 4,000 to 2,400, your shaft RPM will be reduced from 2,000 to 1,200.
Now, what you have to remember is for each inch of increasing the size of a propeller, you lose 200 RPM. And it goes the same way. If you increase the pitch by 1 inch, you also lose 200 RPM. So first thing you do, you have to figure out what size of a pitch you needed for your propeller to be able to develop your hull speed at 1,200 shaft RPM, which is 2,400 engine RPM.
Hull speed plus 30% slippage equals 9.54 knots times 6,076 feet, which equals 1 nautical mile. that equals 57,965 feet per hour. Divide by your shaft RPM, 57,965 feet divided by 1200 RPM equals 48.3 feet. 48.3 feet equals 579.6 inches per hour, and 579.6 inches divided by 60 minutes equals 9.66 inches of pitch. So your propeller will need to have a 10-inch pitch.
It sounds kind of difficult, but once you get the understanding of it, it's quite simple. Because from 4,000 RPM engine, when you reduce it down to 2,400, which is the highest torque, you are reducing your engine RPM by 1,600 RPM.
The engine RPM was reduced from 4,000 to 2,400 RPM, a difference of 1,600 RPM. By increasing the pitch of the propeller by 4 inches, the engine RPM is reduced by 800 RPM, 4 times 200 RPM. 1,600 RPM minus 800 RPM, reduced for pitch, equals 800 RPM. And 800 RPM divided by 200 RPM equals 4 inches, which means you would increase your prop size by 4 inches. The propeller size is increased from 14 inches by 6-inch pitch to 18 inches by 10-inch pitch.
So it sounds kind of complicated on the beginning, but all you have to remember is this thing here. That for each 1 inch increasing the size of a propeller, you lose 200 RPM, and for each 1 inch increase in the pitch, you also lose 200 RPM. So pretty much is that if you increase your pitch by 4 inches, you lose 800 RPM, and if you increase your propeller by 4 inches, you also lose 800 RPM. And 8 and 8 is 16. So 4,000 minus 16, you come with 2,400. Now 2,400 RPM is where you have a higher torque. So now when you are on a long distance, when you run your engine in a calm weather, you can run your engine 2,400 RPM and you go your whole speed. That's a big difference from 4,000. So your longevity of your engine increases almost close to a double, and also your fuel consumption comes to less than a half. Now, some people don't really care about the fuel consumption, but when you're long distance cruisers, there are a lot of places you cannot buy a fuel, and even if they have a fuel, it might be a long distance to come to a harbor to get it.
The fuel graph for our engine shows that we burn 2 gallons an hour at 4,000 RPM and 1 gallon an hour at 2,400 RPM.
And actually, if you go only 1,800 RPM, we burn only a 0.7 gallon of fuel in an hour. Now, figure this one out. At 2,400 RPM, we're going 6.5 knots, and at 1,800 RPM, our speed decreases 1.5 knots, but we get an unbelievable fuel consumption only down to 0.7 of a gallon. That means if you carry 150 gallons the way we do your mathematics, and you're going to see that we get almost 4 times as much mileage when we reduce the RPM. But those figures are given strictly in calm weather. But if the weather should deteriorate, and for some reason you have to power into the wave and into the wind, then you'll find out that your larger propeller do a much better job, when a smaller propeller wouldn't even do no job at all, because our larger wind chops would actually stop you in the tracks. They wouldn't make you any kind of forward motion. And believe me, if you do a cruising for a long time, there are times where you really have to use your engine to power. For example, if in a close proximity of the land and you're in, say, a fjord or someplace where there is no other way to do it, then you really appreciate if your propeller is sized right for a job.
You really have to kind of compromise, though, because you're going to also have to deal with the drag that your propeller will cause, so it's kind of a compromise between the two.
But when you're a cruiser and you carry all the extra gear and so forth, there is not much other choice. The fact is you carry extra anchor gear, which is a lot of extra pounds and so on.
Okay guys, so I guess that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed the video and got something out of it. If you did, don't forget to leave a comment and a thumb up. And of course, we'd like to thank all the people that support our channel through Patreon and PayPal. Thank you so much, guys. We appreciate all of your support.
Bye-bye.
Bye. See you next time.